So this is a custom home build that I have under construction in South Columbia County for some clients that are moving up from South Florida. And so like a lot of my clients that are moving up to the Gainesville, Lake City area from Miami, one of the things they're really interested in is building a concrete block home. So, being from South Florida, being from Miami, these particular clients are used to, every house I've ever lived in has been concrete block. So when they come up to the Gainesville, Lake City area or the Columbia County area, they're looking for the same thing. The thing is that in the Gainesville, Lake City, Columbia County area, there's not that many builders who build concrete block, or at least it's not common. The vast majority of custom homes, vast majority of home builds in general, especially production builds, are going to be wood frame. So when a client moves up here from Miami or South Florida, it's kind of hard to find a builder who wants to build block homes. So when I met with these clients, that was one of the first things they asked is, would I build a block home? And, do I have experience building block homes and so forth? Because they wanted to build the home, much more similar to how homes would be built in the Miami area compared to how most homes are being built in Columbia County. And so, why is that? So the main reason why you're going to see most homes in Miami built with concrete block, and then as you move further up north in the state, up in the Gainesville, Lake City area, why most homes are wood frame is because of wind zones. So in Miami, they're in the 180 mile an hour wind zone. And then in the, South Columbia County area, we're looking at the 130 mile an hour wind zone, which is where this home is. Gainesville's 130 mile an hour wind zone. Lake City, the northern part of Lake City, the northern part of Columbia County is even the 120 mile an hour wind zone. So that difference in wind speed, determined by the state of Florida, is the main reason why, all the homes in Miami and South Florida and even up into Central Florida, most of the homes are going to be concrete block, and why. And this northern part of the state that kind of borders Georgia, why most of the homes are wood frame. And, so from a practical standpoint, what does this mean? So the reason why Miami's in the 180 mile an hour wind zone is because Miami, Fort Lauderdale, the Keys and so forth is really liable to get hit by a Category 4, Category 5 hurricane, head on. There's very little, there's a couple of islands out in the ocean to potentially weaken the storm, but it's not enough to, really soften the blow. So that is, the main reason why, concrete block homes are needed in Miami, because they're 180 mile an hour wind zone and can be hit, straight on by a hurricane. Hurricane Andrew is a great example of that. So I have a path tracker here of Hurricane Andrew when it hit Miami. And as you can see, it doesn't really, lose strength as it heads towards Miami. So because of that, you have to kind of prepare for the worst when it comes to hurricanes, really anywhere in South Florida, whether it's Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Naples. You kind of have to be prepared for a hurricane to hit you head on and be prepared for a Category 5 hurricane. Whereas in the Gainesville area, we get hurricanes, we get storms. A lot of times by the time the hurricanes get towards Gainesville, which really isn't every year either. And the same thing, there's not hurricanes hitting Miami every year. But usually by the time a hurricane reaches Gainesville or reaches South Columbia County or reaches Lake City, it's typically a Category 1 hurricane or tropical storm strength winds. With that being said, the state of Florida has deemed that we're in the 130 mile an hour wind zone, which means that we could receive up to 130 mile an hour winds. So that's what we from an engineering standpoint, that's what our homes need to be designed to withstand. And so Hurricane Idalia a few years ago is a good example of that. So we have the path tracker here. This one hit on the Gulf Coast, came across the state, and by the time it reached the center part of the state, it had weakened to still serious winds. And what that looks like in our area, typically when a hurricane comes through like this, is you'll have a lot of downed trees. Maybe some shingles blown off of a roof, a handful, not the whole roof, at least from what we typically see. And a lot of power lines down from limbs falling. But that's the main thing we're seeing, is that the hurricane's coming through here, and the weaker branches falling or the weaker trees falling, and it mainly causing power line damage, or if your house is underneath the tree, limbs or the tree falling on your home. That is very common. So with that being said, in Miami when Hurricane Andrew came through, the winds pushed over the walls of the home, blew the roof off the house, blew the trusses off the roof decking and so forth. In this area, we're mainly seeing damage. There's some wind damage when it comes to shingles primarily, but it's mainly trees falling that are damaging homes and damaging power lines and so forth. But with that being said, for clients that have lived in concrete block houses their whole life, they move up here and they still want that security of a concrete block home, even though the wind zones are lower. And even though, there's plenty of wood frame homes here that have, stood the test of time over the last 100, 150 years, through all the hurricanes there's some homes here in, the Gainesville, Lake City area that have been around since the 1800s that have lasted through a lot of hurricanes. With that being said, there are clients that are just more comfortable from a wind standpoint, from a longevity standpoint, from an investment standpoint, against termites, house fires, so on and so forth. It's just a little bit of a sturdier long-term construction option. So there are definitely, whenever I get clients that move up here from South Florida, that is often a question I get asked is, whether or not we're willing to do concrete block. And then of course, what are the implications of doing concrete block, from a cost standpoint and a timeline standpoint and so forth. And so on this home, in addition to the block walls, my clients also wanted to implement other things that we're typically seeing in South Florida. So, impact glass windows, they wanted to include all out swing doors, which is typical in South Florida. So that way the wind down there, so that the wind doesn't blow the doors in on your house. They wanted to do that up here, as well as a standing seam metal roof. So there are shingle roofs in South Florida, but metal roofs, tile roofs are much preferred. They're not as likely to blow off during a storm. So that was something they wanted to do up here. Just again, something they're comfortable with and a little bit, more secure long term. Then we also did hardy board soffits at this house, which is not something that people always think of with a South Florida style build, but it is a sturdier option. I'm actually doing standard in all my homes where we can use hardy soffits just because it's a more durable option. And that was one thing we did on this house, as well as 5/8 CDX plywood roof decking. I know we did that for the standing seam metal roof. It's the right substrate that most of the metal roofing manufacturers specify in their product approvals. But I'm doing 5/8 roof decking on all my houses, which is not typical in this area, but is one thing that is also similar to a South Florida style build. And so, like I said, this property is in South Columbia County. This is family property, so these clients are moving up from South Florida. It's a family members that lived in the area, and they got this particular property from their family members. And so it's about equal distance from High Springs and Fort White, a little bit further to Lake City, but kind of right in the middle of that area in South Columbia County. And so the first thing I'll do whenever building a house is I always get the surveyor to come out and stake the home for us. So that way, whenever we start laying out the foundation, we know that we're building the home squared up to the property lines or squared up to the road. And we're not going to be at an awkward angle, in case a fence is put in or anything like that. I also want to make sure we're not building in any easements or any building setbacks or anything like that. So I'll always take the step of having the surveyor come out and square us up to exactly where the homeowner wants us to be. And then, also on this house, so we did a monolithic slab foundation. So with the block walls, the reason why I did that mainly is because we're doing hardy board siding on this house. Typically if we're going to do a stucco exterior, I do a stem wall foundation. But with, doing the hardy board, I'm doing a mono on this house. And it's a very typical foundation type in Florida. It's very common. It's also known as slab on grade. And so you see that here, putting up the form boards. And then, here we, because we're building on a slab, we put the plumbing in underneath the slab. And so you see that here, after, we bring in fill dirt, then put up form boards and then run plumbing. And then we'll compact the fill dirt over the top of the plumbing and then do slab prep, which is what we've got here. So we've got visqueen down, we've got rebar in the footers. We've got welded wire, which is something I use in all my slabs. I feel like it holds the slabs together much better than fiber mesh or some of the other options you can meet code with. I really like the wire mesh that we use here. Then we also got the vertical dowels coming up from the footers that will hold the concrete block walls down to the slab. And then, so once we got the slab poured, that's when we start laying the block walls. And so, how long does this take? So for smaller to medium-sized homes, which this home's on the smaller end of what I typically build, you're looking about 1 week for the concrete block exterior walls. And so that's laying the block walls and then getting cell inspection, basically checking rebar and make sure it's all in the right spots. And we have the bond beam at the top of the wall in place. And then, pouring, pumping the cells, pouring the bond beam and so forth. That's typically all within 1 week. Now I have one house that's a concrete block home that's under construction right now that's larger, it's about 6,800 square feet total. Now that home's gonna take about 2 weeks for the exterior block walls. But, in general, you're usually looking about 1 to 2 weeks. So as far as added time, you're not adding that much time doing the concrete block walls. And of course it saves a little bit of time once you start framing, not having to put up exterior walls and exterior sheathing and so forth. But, from a time standpoint, it really doesn't add on that much time. Now, from a cost standpoint, it does add on cost. So, on the smaller end, you're looking at about $15,000, $20,000 in cost for a smaller home. Larger homes can easily be $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 in cost to do block and, in comparison to a wood frame house. So it doesn't really add that much from a time standpoint. From a cost standpoint, it can certainly add some cost. It also depends on the builder. Like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of builders that don't want to build concrete block homes in the Gainesville, Lake City area. So there's some builders that will build concrete block homes, but they just charge a premium to do it. So it'll be even higher than that, $15,000 to $60,000 range I just mentioned. I've heard builders say it adds 5% to costs. And depending on how large the home is, that can be, more than that range I just mentioned. So, it really does depend on the builder. It also depends on the shape of the home and the complexity of, how tall the walls are, all that type of stuff. I mean, if you go down into Key West or into Miami, you're seeing a lot of 2-story block homes, laying 2-story block walls, with extended scaffolding and so forth can add quite a bit more cost than your typical 1-story house. So there is some variance there, and it kind of depends on circumstances for the exact cost. But that's a good, give you a good idea of a range. I mean, this particular home's on the smaller end of what I build. It was about a $15,000 to $20,000 difference between the wood frame walls that we could have done versus the block walls that we're laying here. And so, like I mentioned, at the end of the week, we'll pump the cells, pour the bond beam, set the header straps for the trusses at the top of the wall, and then we'll get into interior framing. So, on this home, we have block exterior walls, but we do have 2x4 interior wood frame walls, which is typical. I mean, in South Florida, you are seeing some metal studs, becoming more popular, but the 2x4 interior walls is still pretty standard. We're also doing 3/4 inch rigid foam on the exterior walls for insulation, along with 1x4 furring strips that you see here. And so, like it's pretty typical throughout Florida, we're using engineered trusses on this home. In Florida, we're typically using engineered trusses. So that way we can see, it's designed in a computer program. We're able to see the wind impact on the trusses, as opposed to other parts of the country where they're doing rafter framing, or conventionally framing the roofs. Now, one thing that's not typical about this house is we actually have a gable roof, which you're not really seeing a lot of in South Florida because the gable roofs do, bear the brunt a little bit more against a hurricane force winds. But, the homeowner in this case is going for a more country style cottage home. So the gable roof kind of fit a little bit better. And plus, it's not a super steep pitch. It's a 612 roof pitch on this house. And of course, we're going to do, gable end bracing and whatnot. So this house will, definitely be able to stand up to any North Florida winds. But that is one difference that you're not really seeing a lot of in South Florida, is a lot of gable roofs. Now, one thing we also did similar to South Florida style construction is we use 5/8 CDX plywood. So I use 5/8 CDX plywood, or 5/8 roof decking on all my houses. Whenever I do a metal roof, I use CDX plywood, and whenever I do shingle roofs, I'm using 5/8 Advantech. So on this home, we're doing a standing seam metal roof. So we did the 5/8 plywood. And so at this stage, I'll always walk my roofs. I always want to get an eye on the decking before We put down roofing underlayment. I want to walk it, make sure we don't have any high boards, or make sure we didn't miss any nails. I want to make sure that, there's so many, so many nails that go into a roof and so many boards that, you could have a high corner or you could miss a run. So I just want to make sure that, everything's, being done correctly. And so, like was mentioned, this client wanted impact glass windows, which are on very few homes in North Florida. I mean, I do them maybe every second or third home because I'm a custom home builder, but almost no production homes in Gainesville, Lake City, South Columbia County area are going to have impact glass unless specifically requested. That's what we did on this home. We did MI windows for the impact glass windows. And then we also did that standing seam metal roof I talked about. You see here, my client wanted to go with a medium to darker gray. It's going to kind of go with their exterior color scheme. And then also in this house, we use the Hardy fascia soffit that I talked about. So I use that whenever I can. I've transitioned into that being a standard over the last year or two. So it's just going to hold up a lot better in comparison to the aluminum fascia soffit, which is a standard that most people use. And so, I love building for clients who move up from South Florida. My family moved up from South Florida to the Gainesville area in the 90s. So there's a lot of construction practices that, that people are used to in South Florida that I'm also familiar with. My grandparents still live down there. And, it's definitely a lot of people move up to this area from South Florida. So this was a fun home to build and fun clients to build for. And I'm happy knowing that they're going to be comfortable in this home, and just because they're moving from the southern part of the state to the northern part of the state, they're still able to get the kind of home that they were looking for on their family property.